Imagine a country that has less than 2% of the world's population, but produces 1/5 of the world's industrial output. A country whose merchant fleet, by tonnage, is comparable to all the other fleets in the world combined. A country that controls not only a vast empire, but also half of the world's economy through banks, loans, and trade. This is mid-9th century Britain. And the key question is, why was it Britain, of all countries, that first broke out of millennia of poverty and entered the era of modern economic growth? In 1850, the British economy was advanced even compared to other countries of Western Europe, not to mention the rest of the world. Less than 2% of the world's population lived in England, yet it produced 1/5 of all global industrial output and up to 2/3 of the modern sectors. The industries born from the Industrial Revolution: textiles, metal, machinery, and everything that spins, smokes, and buzzes. Britain built the largest empire in human history. The historian Eric Hobsbawm wrote, loosely quoted, that in the second half of the 19th century, the English gained direct control over 5 million square kilometers, but lost indirect control over the rest of the world. In other words, they governed the colonies politically, but London's economic influence reached far beyond them. People said that Argentina and Brazil were not colonies of the British Crown, but colonies of the Bank of England. And the tonnage of Britain's merchant fleet was comparable to that of all the other fleets in the world combined. But listing the scale alone isn't enough. Britain's significance isn't just that it became rich and powerful. What truly matters is that it was times that the logic of all previous human history first broke. Until the 19th century, the economy operated according to a very simple and rather bleak pattern that economists call the Malthusian trap. If economic growth happened somewhere, better harvests, more craft production, rising incomes, it almost always led to the same sequence: population growth, pressure on resources, and eventually a return to roughly the same standard of living as before. GDP could rise, but GDP per capita barely changed. A Babylonian farmer and an 18th century German farmer lived not that differently. Slightly different tools, but the same basic level of poverty and vulnerability. And then, in the early 19th century, this logic finally breaks in Britain. The economy grows, the population grows as well, but the standard of living per person stops treading water and begins to rise steadily. This is what historians call the transition to modern economic growth. And now our question becomes, why did this break with a millennia-old pattern happen? Specifically in the early 19th century, and specifically in Britain, and not, say, in China, India, or the Netherlands? To answer this question, historians developed the concept known as the Great Divergence. The idea is that somewhere between the 18th and 19th centuries, Western Europe and Britain in particular surged ahead of Asia in income, industry, and technology. The American historian Kenneth Pomeranz argues that this divergence began quite late, really only in the 19th century. And here's the key point. If you compare England to China as a whole, Europe looks richer. But Pomeranz suggests looking more closely, not all of China, but its most advanced region, the Yangtze Delta. And there, according to his estimates, the standard of living in the late 18th century was comparable to that of northwestern Europe. If you measure wages in silver and precious metals, then in some parts of Asia, they even appear times higher, simply because of the inflow of silver and gold from the Americas. At the same time, Pomeranz argues that the 18th century Chinese economy was no less dynamic than the English one. And in terms of business freedom and fewer regulations, coastal China practically resembled a neoliberal ideal. And both Europe and China, in his view, were hitting the same ecological limits: deforestation, land scarcity, and population pressure. According to Pomeranz, what pulled Europe and especially Britain ahead? Two key factors: colonies and coal. The Caribbean islands were turned into gigantic slave plantations. Population there was tightly controlled, and sugar, along with other calorie-rich goods, flowed to Europe, The unfree laborers were fed with cheap grain from what would later become the United States. Europe, in turn, gained access to ghost acres external territories that supplied resources and calories, without putting additional pressure on its own ecosystem. Plus, silver and gold from Spanish America provided the monetary base needed to buy goods in Asia. Europe, and especially England, gained vast external markets for its manufactured products, first in the Americas and later in India. And finally, Britain itself had abundant coal, which saved it from ecological collapse. It could stop burning forests and shift to fossil fuel. It starts to look as if old Lenin was right. Europe's success came from colonies and over-exploitation. But then the problems begin. The deeper you go into the details, the more contradictions start to pop up in this picture. So, we have Britain, which by the mid-19th century controlled a vast empire and broke the millennia-old logic of the Malthusian trap. And we have a beautiful theory claiming that all of this happened thanks to colonies, coal, and the ghost acres of the New World. In the next episode, we'll examine why Pomeranz's version and the California school more broadly sounds highly convincing, yet collapses under closer factual scrutiny. We'll talk about silver and wages, about why Spain, despite mountains of American silver, never became a second Britain, and where exactly the logic of Europe got rich solely because of colonies begins to break.